social and cultural history of cycling in Belgium before the Second World War. He has since published extensively on labour relations, transnational dynamics, and national identity in Belgian sports. And today he is talking to us about the socio-political movements and how they influenced and developed sport in the 20th century Belgium. So take it away.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, as you probably hear, my voice is a bit off, so I hope you can all understand me. If not, listen more closely, because this is the maximum volume I can reach at the moment. To begin with, the idea that sports are fundamentally non-political, that they are a common good for all of society, is ingrained in many national and international sports organizations. But what I want to look at today are instances in which sports organizations identified as being exactly the opposite, as being political or, more broadly speaking, defined by a religious or social ideology, and thus put themselves at odds with this idea of a mainstream, non-political sports culture. In doing so, I focus on Belgium. Now, from the late 19th century on, this country's political and social life, like in the Netherlands, was strongly influenced by pillarisation, which we can define as the segregation of society along politico-ideological lines. In response to the challenges of modernization and motivated by a desire to keep their voters under their influence, Belgium's main political groups, Catholics, Socialists and Liberals, established a whole network of organizations, trade unions, mutual aid societies, but also newspapers or women's clubs to do this. And in all aspects of life, these associations serve to fulfill its members' needs and keep them aligned to the group's ideology. And in what follows, I will focus on Belgium's Catholic and socialist pillars. These were not only the two dominant ones, but they also invested the most energy in sports. Now, what I want to find out is how did these pillars try to neutralize, accommodate, or encapsulate this mainstream sports culture which was commercialized, professionalized, and secular? How did these attempts impact the sporting experience of the average Belgian, and also how did this dynamic change over time? Now, modern sports first took off in Belgium from the 1880s onwards among the urban middle classes, and around the turn of the century they gained even more ground as sports like boxing or especially cycling also gained a growing working class following. Now, as an aspect of the broader modernization of Belgian society, this new sporting culture presented a challenge. This was first of all the case for the Catholic Church and the Catholic political party, which in the same period was establishing a powerful network of organizations. And there are a lot of similarities here to Professor Dirk's talk. So the Church feared that the focus on the body of modern sports would lead to moral and spiritual neglect, endangering both faith and morality. Moreover, the fact that sports like cycling or football were often practiced in highly secular, highly commercial environments as well, threatened to wrest their practitioners or their spectators from the church's control. Those who went to the stadium, for instance, were opening themselves up to all kinds of possible sins like worshipping athletes, gambling or drinking, and would eventually, so was feared, break off all ties with the church. This fundamentally anti-modern perspective is evidenced by the use of the term sportfurie, in Catholic circles, which nicely represented their fears of physical excess and moral uprooting through sport. This is evident in texts such as this 1913 novella about a young racing cyclist who leaves his village and its pious lifestyle to pursue his sporting dreams and eventually dies in a cycling crash. Now, all this, of course, didn't mean Catholics could never play sports. Although it promoted asceticism, the Church did not preach a complete neglect of the body. Instead, it advised a healthy balance between the spiritual and the physical. And within this context, there was room for sport, as long as it was practiced in a balanced and, most importantly, in a controlled setting. Catholics, for instance, formed their own gymnastics clubs in the late 1880s already. And Catholic secondary colleges, like that of the Severian order in Bruges, where some of the country's Catholic elite were educated, were even among the earliest adopters of football in the country. Already in the 1860s, the game was introduced here by British expat students and was gradually incorporated into the school's curriculum. Influenced by the idea of muscular Christianity, some, especially younger clergymen, saw the game as an opportunity to teach their pupils moral values like courage and willpower. And in 1907, this growing culture of Catholic college football led to the formation of the Archiepiscopal Sports Federation, which organized an annual competition for the Cardinals' Cup, pictured here, for Catholic colleges in the Archdiocese of Mechelen. So from early on then, Catholic organizations had some success in encapsulating modern sports within their organizational network. But after the Great War, stakes were raised. In the interwar years, Belgian sporting culture fully came into its own as part of an emerging mass society. Watching or practicing cycling or football became a favorite pastime of many more Belgians, certainly in the working classes. And simultaneously, the socialist movement also achieved a nationwide breakthrough. While this movement had already made headway in some of Belgium's industrial areas before the war, its membership, political influence, and network of organizations now expanded at a very fast pace. And while earlier socialist initiatives in physical activity were mostly limited to gymnastics, this too now changed. Socialist sports promoters all across Europe, indeed, now developed a distinct workers' sport philosophy, to which Belgian socialists also subscribed. This workers' sport presented physical activity as a means of educating both mind and body according to socialist principles. And the latter were starkly contrasted with what was seen as the tenets of mainstream capitalist or bourgeois sport. Instead of sports spectatorship, for one, actively playing sports oneself was promoted. Competition, on the other hand, was discouraged, as were keeping records or worshipping individual athletes. Socialist sport had to promote solidarity and the collective, not bourgeois values like militarism. Any form of paid sportsmanship as well was unwanted, as professional athletes were often seen as being exploited by their clubs or their sponsors. Now, with the founding of the National Socialist Federation for Physical and Moral Education, unfortunate name, in 1919, this workers' sport was organized on a national level. 2 years later already, the federation offered sports ranging from football to athletics to cycling to even basketball. And in certain regions, this workers' sport became a strong competitor for mainstream sports organizations. The Workers' Football Union, for instance, united more than 320 teams by 1930. So while this socialist movement actively tried to reshape sports, the same remained true for the Catholic Church in this period. On the one hand, some clergymen, some Catholic organizations continued to rail against the sports fury. On the other, offering sports in a controlled environment was more vital than ever to keeping the masses under the Church's influence. The Archiepiscopal Sports Federation, for one, grew fast. In 1920, it also began organizing a football competition for Catholic working men's clubs. A few years later, it began incorporating sports like athletics. And in 1932, finally, the federation renamed itself as the Catholic Sports Union, affirming its ambition to become a truly national Catholic sports organization. Now, this well-worn tactic of encapsulating sports was not the only Catholic approach in the interwar years. Starting in 1936, the Benedictine father Anton van Klee, in the middle, struck up conversations with training bicycle racers he encountered around his home abbey in Tongerlo. And within a few years, van Klee developed these improvised contacts with athletes into a full-fledged program of pastoral care for athletes in all kinds of sporting disciplines. In 1944, he named his organization Sporta, which was short for Sports Apostolate. Through activities like religious retreats or pilgrimages for both beginning and high-profile sportsmen, there were some Tour de France winners among them, for instance, van Klee tried to bring Catholic morality into top-level sports. To be sure, Sporta's opinion of secular sports remained similar to that of most contemporary Catholic organizations. Realigning all of society with the teachings of the Church remained its ultimate goal. But instead of encapsulating sports within the Church, Sporta tried to conquer sports culture from within, so going to sports culture instead of bringing it into the Church. So both Catholic and socialist organizations had a well-established presence in the Belgian sports landscape during the interwar years. But at the same time, both pillars' sporting activities were marred by ambiguities. Because despite the idealism of many promoters of Catholic or socialist sports, completely shutting out the influence of mainstream sports culture was almost impossible. Sometimes this was accepted because of pragmatic reasons. At its foundation, for instance, the Archiepiscopal Sports Federation became an associate member of Belgium's neutral National Football Association. While official Catholic discourse was opposed to such neutral organizations, the Federation made a pragmatic choice here, since by joining the association, it could use its referees and its football pitches, which it hardly had of its own. But pragmatism was not the only factor. Especially in sports in which a lot of money went around, the Catholic Federation had a hard time keeping its members loyal. In the 1930s, for instance, some of its football clubs, which were all amateur, lost players to this National Football Association. Because in the latter, these athletes could not only play for the biggest clubs in the country, but as the National Association allowed professional play, they could now also get paid to play. Okay. The same problems were present in the socialist sports organizations. Even committed socialists, as it turned out, still like to watch the exploits of capitalist cycling heroes or go to a bourgeois stadium. Sometimes even more so than doing politics. In 1925, for instance, a local Socialist Party meeting in the town of Roeselare had to be postponed because its participants first wanted to watch the passage of a cycling race through the town. A man had to have priorities. More troubling was that even socialist sporting events and athletes found it hard to adapt to the principles of worker sport, especially if their sport of choice was competitive and individualist by nature and was commercially successful. The strongly professionalized sport of bicycle racing serves as a case in point. From 1928 onwards, the worker sport movement organized the so-called Red Tour of Belgium, a stage race throughout the country. While the race was presented as a true socialist alternative to commercial races, like the Tour of Flanders, this was hardly always the case in reality. Not only did each stage have a clear winner, from 1931 on, its racers were also sponsored by bicycle firms and could win cash prizes. Without these concessions to commercialism, it seemed, the race would have had it hard to attract participants. And when having to choose between ideological purity and having an impact, then the socialist movement sometimes also chose the latter. But even this was not enough. Some of the best socialist racers still transferred their allegiance to Belgium's mainstream cycling union when they wanted to make a living from their sport. Such was, for instance, the case for this man here, the Walloon rider Louis Mullenberg, who rode in the Socialist Union in his younger years, but eventually turned mainstream and ended up winning the UCI World Road Championship in 1937. So let us now fast forward to the 1960s, because in these years, Belgian society changed profoundly, influenced by developments like the growth of consumerism, intense secularization, and the blurring of class distinctions. Presented with an increasing number of options for leisure and consumption, the average Belgian was no longer prepared to keep within the confines of Catholic or socialist networks. And a process of depillarisation followed from this. While this did not lead to the complete dismantling of pillarized organizations, in both Catholic and socialist circles, their former ideological core, be it church teachings or the class struggle, was increasingly relegated to the background. In both cases, what came instead was a more general focus on social justice, ethics, and emancipation. At the same time, important changes took place in Belgium's sports policy. In 1969, the national government devolved its responsibility for sports to the Flemish and Walloon regional governments. And 1 year later, the Flemish sports agency, the BLOZO, initiated its first Sports for All campaign. For the first time in the country's history, this campaign aimed at increasing recreational sports practice among Flemings to promote health and well-being. Large-scale promotional drives and the government financing of new sports infrastructure had to put this policy into practice. Now, the influence of all these developments on pillarized sports was profound. Let's just look at one example from the Catholic angle. The case of the Catholic workers' movement really evidenced how the Catholic perspective had changed. Now, at its conception in 1942, the so-called Katholieke Werknemersbeweging, or KWB, united all adult males within this politically powerful Catholic workers' movement. This KWB initially focused strongly on the religious and moral education of Catholic men as fathers and as husbands. But its role changed as well in the 1960s. The strict obedience to church teachings it had promoted now took a back seat. And in its place came a broad focus on improving the well-being and social-cultural emancipation of workers and their families. And it was in this context that sports came into view as well. The organization now presented the average worker's lack of regular physical exercise as a social problem, not a religious one. In a growingly sedentary society, it led them to miss out on opportunities for personal development. And therefore, the KWB began promoting recreational sports among its more than 130,000 members in the early 70s. Her regional sections set up swimming lessons for adults, for instance, while local chapters started volleyball or football clubs. Pragmatic motivations played a role here as well, of course, as a focus on sports also had the advantage of attracting people who otherwise had little interest in the KWB's activities. Now, in 1974, the KWB united all of these sporting initiatives in a new federation of workers' associations for physical education and sports called VELOS, unfortunate name again. By the late 70s, this federation had hundreds of clubs all over Flanders, practicing sports like volleyball, football, or family-friendly activities like walking. And what is remarkable is that VELOS strongly depended on the financial support of BLOZO, Flemish Sports Agency. The organization in itself, indeed, was only financially viable because of the funding the agency provided. And in other aspects too, Velos profited from Bolozzo's support. The initiation courses for sports instructors the agency offered, for instance, were eagerly used by Velos to train its own staff and volunteers. So instead of offering an alternative to official government policy, Velos largely depended on its resources. The organization was also kind of marked by ambiguity in other ways, as for instance the hope expressed by some in the KWB that sports could help introduce more people to the organization's wider program of social action yielded little result. On the contrary, some local KWB sports sections in local chapters became completely independent entities over the course of time. So actually became severed from the larger organization. So KWB's sporting initiatives introduced some people to sports, but few to its wider program of action. Lastly, socialist sports organizations showed remarkable similarities to their Catholic counterparts in these years. Here too, the 1970s saw a reorientation towards the kind of recreational sports promoted by Bolozzo. While this was occasionally still presented as a step on the way towards a socialist society, the ideals of interwar workers' sport had all but disappeared. In both Catholic and socialist sporting organizations then, sweeping changes in society had strongly altered earlier, strongly ideological visions of sport, which, however, despite all the promotion, all the goodwill, and all the theory, were in practice always marred by some kind of ambiguity, some kind of intrusion by a mainstream, secular, commercialized sporting culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Nick.
Thanks a lot, Stan. I was just wondering if you've had a chance to look at the linguistic, or if there were any linguistic differences. You have the pillarisation, you have the Catholic movement.
Yeah.
What about the Flams Boulogne, I'll say issue rather than...
Yeah. Well, I purposely left that out because it would take me even further. But there was a big difference in the sense that these socialist sporting organizations were especially well developed in the Francophone, in the Walloon part of the country. Because this is where you had the big industrial areas, mining, steel. This is where also Belgian Socialist Party was very strong in terms of votes. And it wasn't a coincidence that, where is he? This guy, Eloï Mullenberg, he was a Walloon. He grew up in the town of Jumet, in the Charleroi area, which still is deeply red in its politics. So for him to start his career in cycling, it would have been kind of to say almost natural that he came into contact with these socialist sporting organizations. Well, on the other hand, in Flanders, which was much more Catholic, it was especially these Catholic sporting organizations that overall had more impact. So there was a definite linguistic difference, yeah.
Anything outstanding, more questions? I have a quick one. In terms of Catholic sport,
Sorry?
Catholic sport, start, who was central to that? Was it the church that took the central driving force behind it, or was it the congregation?
Yeah. Well, in terms of official Catholic Church teaching, there were already some, how to say, some small openings towards sport becoming part of Catholic society from the 1890s onward in papal encyclicals, etc. It all depended on how people interpreted them. So, in some cases, like the Archiepiscopal Sports Union, the initiators were clergymen, but they were clergymen who had a very specific idea of sports, in the sense that sports could be practiced as long as it was in a controlled environment. So it really depended on the organization or even specific clergymen, what their view of sport was, and to what lengths they were willing to go to promote it, if sports were accepted or promoted within specific Catholic organizations. So for instance, you also had youth movements where sport was present from the interwar years onwards, but with the distinct caveat that it should never come in the first place, and it should always be an aside to the more important social, religious teachings of that organization.
And perhaps we have time for the questions. So can we have a round of applause, please, for Esther?